Well, welcome everybody. My name is Christy Barker, and I'm the Director of Education and Programming and Curator at the Biblical History Center. And we are so excited today to have our guest speaker, Caleb Smith, who's a Roman coin expert and one of our lovely Roman soldier reenactors that comes every May, and that one time October because COVID, to participate in our Roman Army Day. And so even though we're here virtually, we're also looking forward to seeing him next week. Thank you so much, Caleb, for being willing to speak, and I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm really happy to be here and really excited to share some stuff with you guys. So let me go ahead and do the screen sharing here. I don't know, does it show my face as well? I'm not very familiar with this.
It depends on the display that people choose.
I got you. Okay.
Yeah, so for mine, it still shows your face, but for others, they might just see your PowerPoint.
No worries, that's cool. Let's do this, perfect. Okay, so to start out, I'm Caleb Smith. I've been a Roman reenactor for probably 8-9 years now, ever since I was in high school. And I've been really interested in ancient numismatics, or the study of ancient money, over the last 2 or 3. I have to give a huge thank you to my good friend Brian Cohn, who is also part of Legion 14, and he is just now getting his master's degree in ancient numismatics from the University of Southern Florida. And he's been super integral in this whole process of introducing me to this stuff and helping me through it. So while I don't have a degree, I learned from someone who does, and I really do appreciate him for everything he's done. So the presentation today is going to be a general overview of coinage in the ancient world with an emphasis on the biblical timeline. So as I go through the pieces I've chosen, a lot of them have to do specifically with biblical history, or at least have some sort of significance to the biblical timeline, and I'll walk through that as I go. As much as possible, I tried to include pieces from my collection, stuff that hopefully if you come to Roman Army Day next year or in the future, that I'll be able to show you in person. But I did have to fill in the gaps with stuff from either the internet or stuff that people that I know have in their collections, just because some of these things are outside of my budget right now. Sometimes you have to choose between the coin and a house or a car, and you know it's hard to argue with those numbers. So so what did humans do before money? So money was an invention, and prior to that, there really wasn't a good medium of exchange. So humans bartered, they traded. And it was easy in the early hunter-gatherer societies to do this because there wasn't a whole lot that people had on hand. There wasn't like a whole lot of craftsmanship, or everything was very simple. And it did work on a local level, but as societies began to settle down into cities and villages, this sort of trade was more difficult because you didn't always have what somebody else needed. Like you might need milk, but your neighbor who has cows, who has milk, doesn't want to trade you for the bread that you make. And so there needed to be some sort of medium of exchange, so that even if you didn't necessarily have an item that someone else wants, you can still trade them for something that's valuable to them. So actually the first standardized form of exchange was actually cows. And that's recorded as far back as 3500 BC. Although admittedly, it's kind of hard to put a cow in your wallet, let alone like 10 or 20 of them. So we really needed to work out something a little better. So proto money. Proto money is basically societies as they began to settle down and really grow out of the nomadic hunter-gatherer cultures and to become stationary. They needed a way that was better than, you know, trying to haul 25 cows to trade for a kilogram of grain or something. So different cultures established different methods by which they would trade and by which they would a sort of a generally accepted medium. One of the most universal forms that you see in the Celtic cultures, which I have mentioned here, and then also in the Middle East, is actually just bronze trinkets. So armbands. In this case, in the picture, you have some bells. In the Middle East, they were very fond of axe blades, but they were things that could be easily carried. They were things that were considered valuable because metal was fairly rare in the ancient world and it was very useful for almost anything that they needed. And so it was a great medium of exchange for those people. In Lydia, which is in Western Turkey, sort of the seacoast of Turkey, near Greece, they actually used electrum nuggets. And electrum is an alloy of gold and silver, and it occurred naturally on the surface near rivers there. And so it was a very valuable commodity because it was fairly easy to shape. And it was beautiful and unique compared to pretty much anything else that you could find around. And then in the Roman Republic and in the early days of the Roman Republic, before money became widespread, they actually would just get molten bronze and pour it into the sand or into water and to create these chunks of bronze that they would break down and then they would use as currency by weighing it out. And these were good short-term solutions, especially at a local level. But once you want to go trade with somebody else, they may not accept your form of proto-currency. So it was very important that the idea of currency became more standardized. So we're going to take a really brief look at what metals were used by ancients for their money. And it's pretty common, even until our era, to see a lot of these used in money. So gold is the primary one. I mean, it's when you think of money and you think of like wealth, gold, silver, these things come to mind. Gold was the pinnacle. It's extremely rare. It's extremely easy to work. And the best part about gold is it's almost completely chemically unreactive. So you can put it in water. It's not going to rust. It's not going to tarnish. It retains its beauty. It has a very unique color amongst the metals. And so it was considered sort of the pinnacle of value in the ancient world. And that idea even persists to this day. And then, of course, you have electrum, which is an alloy of gold and silver. It's rarer in coinage. It appears very early on, and it appears during the medieval period. You don't see it too much, but I did include it here. Silver is the workhorse of the ancient world as far as money is concerned. It's scarce enough to be considered very valuable, but it has enough supply that it could be minted in large quantities. And so this was the way that day-to-day trade took place between businesses, between different powers. And it was the way that your average person would store their wealth. Most average people would never have access to gold. Gold was a very high tier coinage that would really be kept at the high tier government level. So like government officials, high tier army officials, things like that. But for the commoner, silver was everything. It was their method by which they could store their money. Then you have villin. It only appears every now and again. It's just a very debased form of silver, which means it was mixed with a lot of low tier metal to the point where it was completely unrecognizable in some cases. And this will be important later, but not really so much in the early period. And copper tends to be the most ubiquitous when you're looking for ancient coins to buy. You search up ancient coins for sale or whatever, and the vast majority that you're going to find within a reasonable price range are in copper or some alloy of copper. And they were minted in fractionals in order to break down silver into chunks that was easily tradable. They recognized pretty early on that it was really hard to make tiny little silver coins to trade. And so they used copper as almost an early form of fiat currency, a way to basically to say, okay, this chunk of copper is worth X amount of silver, and then use that as a medium of exchange. And then you have bronze and orichalcum, excuse me. Bronze, it's alloy of copper and tin. And then orichalcum is what we would call bronze, or brass. The Romans called it orichalcum, but today we know that it was copper and zinc, which is which is brass. It has a very gold color. But these are just the basic metals that you'll see. So very briefly, how coins were made. Unlike in our modern day where we have machines that just churn these things out, in the ancient world it was a little bit different. Instead of being cast or instead of being made by a machine, they were all handmade and they were actually struck. So what that means is they would take a sheet of the metal, they would cut out a planchet or a flan, which is the base of the coin. And then they would heat it up to red hot, and they would take a die like this, and they would put it on top with an anvil below, and they'd take a hammer and they would strike the coin. So each ancient coin is unique because they would hire craftsmen to make these dies, and they would only work for a certain amount of time before they would get old. They would get dull and they'd have to be replaced. And because each one is hand struck, each one is slightly different from all the others. And so ancient coins are as much art as they are money. And so on this next one, actually, it's a little funny because it proves that counterfeiting is as old as money is. It's actually a counterfeit die that was actually made to cast coins instead of strike them. In the ancient world, it was almost entirely struck coins issued by governments, but counterfeiters would cast them because it was a lot easier to do that than to make dies to strike. So it's just something kind of funny. It's actually very rare to find dies still today. I certainly don't own one, but it's actually far more common to find these counterfeit dies that they would cast in. So we're going to use this coin from my collection to just establish some basic coin terms so you don't get confused when I start using these terms in the talk. There's just a very few brief ones. So this is a silvered Antoninianus of the Emperor Probus from the late 3rd century. It's one of my favorite pieces because it's just extremely easy to read. It's really pretty. It's got a lot of detail. So we're just going to use it to establish some terms. So the flam I mentioned briefly, it's just the blank piece of metal that the coin is struck on. So the flam is the entire coin. It's just sort of the base of it. So the obverse is just a fancy term for the front of the coin. It's usually where the portrait is, and it usually contains the main legend sort of establishing who minted the coin and sort of their titles. Although not always, but usually that's where the main legend would be. So then you have your portrait, which is sort of your central image on the obverse. Almost all coins feature a portrait of some kind. In this case, it's an emperor, but in a lot of cases, you'd have a deity. In some cases, you would have other important figures, like heroes or something like that. The legend is the text that goes around the portrait. On Roman coins, it's especially during this time period, it's very recognizable. It's very similar to the way that we make ours today. But in some cases, like in the case of the Greeks, for example, they would use square legends or like linear legends where they didn't follow the contours of the edge of the coin. So you'll see that as we go on. But the legend in this case is just extremely easy to read on both the obverse and the reverse of the coin. So the reverse is the back. And a lot of times that's where it features propagandistic imagery. A lot of times there's deities mentioned or pictured, sometimes interacting with whoever's on the obverse or the issuing person, just to sort of establish a connection. And coinage very much was propagandistic in this age because a lot of times that was the way that you knew who was in charge. The first you would hear of a new emperor is when his coins came to your village. So we're going to just take a very quick look at the types of Roman coins, and then we're going to get on to the actual pieces themselves. So the aureus is the main gold coin during the Roman period. It was worth 25 silver denarii. It was the sort of the pinnacle of the Roman monetary system. And unfortunately, I don't have any examples of that to show because those are very, very expensive. So on this particular image, they mentioned the Quinarius aureus, but that was not really minted very often. So I'm really only discussing the major types. So here I mentioned the Antoninianus, which was also called the double denarius. We don't actually know what it was called in antiquity, so this is just a name we've given it to sort of describe what it is. But it was supposed to be worth 2 silver denarii, but it ended up being worth only about 1.5 times in the terms of how much silver was in it. And it was introduced in the late 2nd century as a way to try and uh, make money on tax revenue and to help the government to retain some silver that they were losing during the minting of coinage. So the denarius, it's kind of the standard coin of the Roman Empire. It's it's very famous. It's basically the basic unit of the monetary system. Everything's based around it. A day's wages for a laborer during the 1st century would have been 1 denarius. So it's kind of your standard of the system. Then you have your sestertius, which initially was a silver coin, but during most of the period where it was minted, it was actually a very large bronze coin. Sometimes it was minted in orichalcum or brass, but usually it was bronze. And it was worth 1/4 of the silver denarius, even though it's a lot bigger. Because it's made of bronze, it's worth less. Then you have your depondius, which is worth half a sestertius or 1/8 of a denarius, and it's just a little bit smaller. And on these coins that denote double value, like the Antoninianus being double of the denarius, or the depondius being worth double the sestertius or half of the sestertius, you'll see what's called a radiate crown on a lot of these. It's a pointy crown as opposed to the laurel crown, like the wreath crown that you see in a lot of the portraits. So that just denotes that it's worth double of whatever the base unit is, which in this case would be a coin called the Oz, which is the base copper unit. So it would take 16 of those to equal a denarius. And then there were some smaller denominations, but the main ones are from the Oz to the aureus. And then the smaller ones were really only used for like spare change and things like that. So here we're going to start out with the first coins where coinage began in the very beginning. So it actually started in Lydia, again, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's in what's now Western Turkey, Western Anatolia. And it sort of emerged around the 6th century BC as a way for the local government to control the trade coming in and out and to help them to tax the locals better. So what they did is they took all of these electrum nuggets that had been going around, this proto money, and they melted it all down and they reissued it with the official stamp of the government, in this case, the Lion of Sardis. And it basically just said, this has been approved for transactions in this area. And it helped to standardize so that the merchants didn't have to weigh them out. They knew that if it had the stamp on it, that it was approved to weigh a certain amount. And it helped make transactions far easier. And on the obverse here, you'll see the Lion of Sardis. And then on the reverse, it has what's called an incus punch. It was basically a hole that they would punch in the back to show that the coin was solid metal all the way through, that it was good metal, that it wasn't like a ball of lead that had been dipped in electrum or gold to fake being real. That way it kind of helped them avoid counterfeiters in the early period. But if you notice, the coin itself, it's pretty much just a lump of metal with an image on it. There's not much in the way of quality control. There's a big crack down the back of it. They were more interested in the weight at this point than they were in anything else. Just standardizing the way that the currency worked. And then down here, you have a silver siglos. So the top one is called a stater. It was made of initially electrum, but later they switched to gold and silver and not the mix of the two. So the silver coin was called a siglos. And this one was minted under King Croesus, which was the last king of Lydia while Lydia was independent before it was conquered by the Persians. So you see that the design stays more or less the same. There's now 2 incus punches, and they've added a bull as well as the lion. But other than that, it's pretty much the same thing. It's just a lump of metal stamped with an image, and then it has the infused punches in the back to show that it's solid silver all the way through, that there's no funny business, no bronze, no lead, nothing of that sort in there. So moving on to the Achaemenid Persians. So Lydia was conquered by the Achaemenid Persians under Cyrus the Great. And you might know Cyrus of biblical fame. He was the one who was king during the Babylonian exile at the end, when the Israelites were allowed to return to Israel. So if you look at this coin initially, you might think it's actually just the same one we just looked at, the silver siglos of Crisius. But actually, when the Persians took over, they didn't actually have their own money. So they took the standard that the Lydians had been using and just copied it. So it's fairly easy to tell the difference when you look at the style of the lion and the bull, because it was far more simple. This example does have the paw, but in most examples of coinage that the Persians minted, they actually cut the paw out entirely. So it's just the head of the lion and then the head of the bull. So this one was probably struck under Cyrus or one of his direct successors. It wasn't until Darius the Great, King Darius the First of Persia, that they began to mint their own unique coinage. And that's where the first coin from my collection comes in. This right here is a silver siglos that was minted under either Darius II or Artaxerxes II. So Darius was actually the son of Artaxerxes I, who was, let me check my notes on this just to make sure I say it right. He was mentioned. Yes, he was the Persian king that allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to return to Judea. Nehemiah was his cupbearer. So this is either the son or the grandson of Artaxerxes I that was minting this one. So somebody with biblical significance. So on the obverse, the front, you have the Persian king with a dagger and a bow running to the right. Unfortunately, on this particular one, the face is kind of obscured. It's pretty worn, but it is, you can kind of make out the figure. And then on the reverse, it's just a very basic infused punch. It's actually not very deep. And I'm not sure why they went from the square one to kind of just an indentation, but that's what they did. And I actually have, for those of you who have your cameras on, I don't know how well my camera is going to show up, but I did have them all laid out just to show size. It's about the size of my thumbnail. So it's pretty small, but it's very thick. I don't know if it comes through very well, but it's very small and very thick. But again, they were more interested in the weight than they were interested in the shaping of it. So moving on from the Persians, we're going to go to classical Greece. At the same time that the Persians were flourishing under Cyrus, you see the classical Greek city-states rising up, and none are more famous really than Athens and Sparta. Now, Sparta didn't mint any of its own coinage, and Corinth for a long time used the stater. But Athens created its own standard called the Attic standard, named after Athens. And this particular type they minted was called the Al Tetradrachma. And it is one of the most famous coins in the ancient world, and especially amongst collectors, it's hugely prized. And there's actually a lot of them that survived because of how many were minted over the centuries that it was in use. But because it's so valued by collectors, it's actually very expensive despite being fairly common. This one's an archaic style from around the time they started minting them in this style. And then this one here is in the classical style during the height of Athenian power, during what they call the mass coinage period, when they were minting a ton of these. Athens was extremely wealthy because they had access to a lot of silver mines, and they were also a trading power. And so they made a ton of these coins, and they became the standard across the ancient world for centuries. They were having, some of these types were being minted in places like Egypt. Some were being minted in the borders of India. Some were being minted in Afghanistan. and they're really cool and they're really beautiful. And I wish I had some examples to show. Unfortunately, not only do I not own one of these, but I definitely don't own any of the imitation ones. But unfortunately, I don't really have time to show more of these types. But suffice it to say, they're really cool, and I do recommend if you get the chance looking at more Athenian owls and taking a look at some of the types that spun off from them, because they're really cool. So next, we're going to move on to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, or Alexander III of Macedon, and his father Philip II first united Greece under their rule. And then Alexander, after the death of his father, conquered the entire Persian Empire. So this first coin that I have is actually one of my own. And then I put the other one here to kind of show what the design would look like in a higher detailed version. Mine is a drachma, and the other type is a tetradrachma, or which means it's worth four drachmas. So it's a much larger coin. You could fit a lot more detail. And the one at the bottom is also basically uncirculated, whereas mine probably saw a pretty heavy circulation. But Alexander the Great captured most of the Persian treasury, and he captured most of the Persian coinage. And so he had it all melted down and reissued in the Attic standard. And so coins minted by Alexander the Great and his successors are very common, because he took basically the wealth of the East and melted it down and reissued it in his name. So the coin that we have here, actually both of them, the obverse, the front of the coin shows Alexander the Great wearing the Nemean lion skin. Some people think it was Hercules. And here I have the one right here, the one from the top. So you can see what size it is. It's a little bigger than a dime. It's much thicker. It's about 2 times as thick as a dime. But it shows either Alexander the Great or Hercules wearing the skin of the Nemean lion. And then the reverse is Zeus seated on a throne, holding an eagle. And the text down the right side of the reverse says Alexandru in Greek, which means of Alexander. So Alexander figured that he was famous enough that he really didn't need to put any of his accolades on the coins, because if you were anyone who knew anything, you knew who he was. And this style was so popular that it was minted long after his death. So there are both lifetime issues and posthumous issues. There's certain ways of telling them apart. The easiest way is to look at Zeus's legs. Usually posthumous issues have his legs crossed. In these cases here, you can see that his legs aren't crossed, and so they're probably lifetime issues. They were made during the last few years of his life. But he spread the idea of coinage on the Attic standard basically across the world that was civilized at the time. So next, I'm going to briefly mention the successor kingdoms. And the coins that I've chosen here have, I would say, at least reasonable biblical significance. Obviously, when Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he also conquered Judea, the area where Israel is, during that particular conquest. And so when Alexander the Great died, he didn't leave a successor, and so his generals carved his empire up. And so the way that the lines were drawn, the Israelites fell under the rule of the Seleucid Empire, which is basically the eastern portions of Alexander's holdings. So they took eastern Turkey, they took the sort of the Middle East as we would know it, and then as far as the borders of India and Afghanistan. And they were near their border with the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt and sort of the area immediately north of Egypt. And so they were caught in between the wars of the Alexander the Great successors called the Diadochi. So these particular examples, unfortunately, these aren't mine. Most of my collection is from the Roman period. But just to give you a brief idea of the types of coins that would be circulating around this time, these are both tetradrachms of some of Alexander the Great's successors. So the top one is a silver tetradrachm of King Demetrius the First. And he was king during the height of the Maccabean revolt. The Jews attempted to liberate themselves from Greek rule. They weren't particularly happy with the way that the Greeks were ruling them. And so Demetrius was king during a lot of that time period. So the obverse of the coin shows King Demetrius wearing the headband, which is the sign of kingship in the Greek world at this time. And then the reverse shows a goddess with a cornucopia. And then it has the words Basileus Demetriou, which means of King Demetrius. And then at the bottom, you have a coin minted under the Ptolemaic King Ptolemy the Fourth, or Sixth, excuse me. Right around the same time period, maybe a little bit later. And the obverse is of Ptolemy the First. And on these coins, they all feature Ptolemy the First. Basically the entire series of Ptolemaic tetradrachma. And then on the reverse, it features the Ptolemaic eagle. And then it says Basilei Ptolemaiou, or of King Ptolemy. And so these would have been kind of floating around in trade and in sort of higher circles during the time of the Maccabean revolt and during the time of the institution of the celebration of Hanukkah, which celebrated the sort of it was instituted in part to celebrate the liberation of Judea from the Seleucids. They eventually did actually achieve autonomy after a long series of wars. So now we're going to get to the Romans, which is kind of my specialty. The other ones I know a little bit, but this is where I sort of specialize. So the first one here is another coin that I actually own. It was minted about 20 years after the Romans began to use silver coins. And the Romans liked the Attic standard that the Greeks were using, but they put their own spin on it. So the silver denarius is very similar to the silver drachma that was the basis of the Greek monetary system. So here I have this denarius. For those of you who can see the camera, it's right about the same size as the drachma that I showed of Alexander. The obverse of the coin shows the goddess Roma wearing a helmet. And then the reverse is the goddess Roma driving a quadriga, which is a 4-horse chariot. And then at the bottom, it should say Roma, although in my example, unfortunately, it's a little bit cut off and a little bit worn. But this is what Roman coinage looked like sort of at the beginning, when the Romans first moved from just using either big chunks of bronze or these big clunky bronze cast coins. And they moved to this silver in order to fund their Punic Wars against Carthage. And this is when the Romans went from just being kind of an interesting regional power in Italy to being a Mediterranean powerhouse that could actually challenge the Greek powers of the day. So here is a silver denarius of Pompey the Great, or Pompey Magnus, who was a contemporary of Julius Caesar and one of his rivals. Pompey is notable, at least for biblical history, because he was the one who subjugated Israel to the Romans. He is the one who established the client kingdom under Herod and sort of made Israel a client kingdom of the Romans. And he eventually was executed in Egypt. And then you have the silver denarius of Julius Caesar. The denarius of Caesar here, this specific type, is notable because he was the first person in Roman history to put himself on coinage. It was considered taboo because the Romans during the Republican period were very wary of anyone who might call themselves a king or a monarch. And so by Caesar putting himself on a coin, especially wearing a laurel crown, it made the Romans, who were wary of monarchies, extremely nervous. And so this was the final straw that actually led to his assassination. So it's something that you don't hear a lot, but it was actually coins that were the final nail in the coffin for Caesar, and it's what drove his assassins to kill him. So here, the next one I'm going to show is a silver denarius of his adopted son Augustus, or he was called Octavian. right after the death of Caesar. He was actually his great nephew, but he was adopted as his heir because he didn't have a legitimate male heir. He did have male children. Actually, interestingly, he had a son named Caesarion with Cleopatra, which turned out to be a huge political issue for Augustus later on. But eventually, Augustus prevailed in civil wars against Mark Antony and against the other triumvir Lepidus, who no one remembers. And he established the Roman Empire as we would know it. Although he didn't claim the title of emperor, he called himself the princeps, so the first citizen. But it was very clear who was in charge because all the coinage featured him. And this coin in particular is interesting because a lot of his coinage didn't really feature any sort of legend at all. It would just have his face and then a design on the reverse. And a lot like Alexander, he really felt like everyone knew who he was, so he didn't really need to say more than that. But he really focused on having a very stylized portrait, whereas the one if you see Caesar here, he looks very old. He looks very realistic, I guess. It's slightly stylized, but he's showing his age. On this coin of Augustus, he looks very young and continued to portray himself that way all the way up until his death. And he reigned for 43 years. So he definitely didn't look like this by the end. But the obverse just says Augustus Caesar, Augustus, the heir of Caesar. And then the reverse says Divus Julius, or the divine Julius. Right after the death of Caesar, they deified him, they named him a god, and a cultus actually sprung up around him. And right after his death, there was a comet that appeared in the sky, which people took as a sign that he had become a god. And so this coin actually celebrates that comet. That's what this image is. It shows the light rays coming off the comet, and then the top is the tail as it flew through the sky. So it's a subtle, or it's really not a subtle, it's a very obvious sign that this Augustus is saying, if you mess with me or if you challenge me, you're challenging the son of a god. And Augustus was emperor during the birth and early years of Jesus Christ. So here we have a bronze semis of Tiberius. It's actually one of the base forms of the Oz. It's one of the smaller denominations. Tiberius was emperor during the public ministry and death of Christ, and he was the one who, when the Pharisees asked Christ asked Christ about should we pay taxes, and he says, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's." And the coin that they produced was most likely a denarius of Tiberius. It's speculated that it may have been something else, but most people agree that it was probably a denarius of Tiberius. So the reason I chose this particular example is because it's one I actually own, so it's just easier for me to kind of show it off here. So it's very small again. It's actually a little bit, it's about the size of a dime. It's minted in bronze or copper. And it's very thick again. A lot of ancient coins are very thick because they had to survive the striking process. So it's much thicker than a modern coin would be. But for being a small coin, the portrait is fairly detailed. And if you look, the legends, just like in the Augustus coin, they actually kind of run counter to the way we would think of the legend going. They actually go right to left instead of left to right. But that did change later on. But you see on Tiberius a much more realistic bust. He has kind of a curved nose. And he portrayed himself more realistically than Augustus did. So next we're going to look at Judea in the time of Christ. So the first coin here, unfortunately not one of mine. I'd love to own one of these, but I don't have pockets quite this deep yet. This is a silver shekel of Tyre from around the time of Christ, just before his public ministry. And this was the coin that the temple tax was paid in. So this would actually be the coin that Judas was paid for his betrayal of Christ. So the shekel is roughly synonymous with the tetradrachma. And so it was worth about 4 drachma each, or 4 denarii each, and he was paid 30 of them. So the 30 pieces of silver was actually a very significant sum of money. It was like half a year's worth of wages for a laborer, or somewhere in that period. So when you hear 30 pieces of silver, they're not talking about like little scraps of silver. They're talking about big chunks of silver, about this big. For those of you who have the camera out, they actually probably would have been a little bit bigger than this. This is a little bit of a smaller one, but it would have been about that large. So this is a pretty significant amount of money. It helps put into context the sort of the allure that the 30 pieces of silver would have had. So the obverse shows the Phoenician god Melkart, which unfortunately this example isn't the best one, but it's the best one I could find for this time period. Most of them tend to be older, from the 80 to 50 BC range. So this one is one from the time of Christ. And then the reverse shows the eagle, which was a very common image in the East, sort of borrowed from the Ptolemies, from the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt. The Phoenicians took it and used it in their coinage as well. And then this one, this is actually one of my own collection. This is one of my favorite pieces personally. This was a very small bronze coin that was minted under Pontius Pilate during his governorship of Judea, and it was minted in according to the Rennial year 18 of Tiberius, which puts it at between 31 and 32 AD. So right around the time of Christ's public ministry. This would have probably been circulating in either Jerusalem or one of the surrounding cities. Unfortunately, I don't have the provenance on it or the story of where it was found. I bought it from a reputable coin dealer, and it's not very much to look at. It is very, very small. I don't know if, for those of you who have your cameras out, it's about the size of my thumbnail, and it's actually fairly thin. And this one isn't in the greatest shape, but I was more interested in it as for its historical and religious significance rather than its artistic quality. But the front of it, that little fern-looking hook, is called the letus. It's a Roman divining instrument that the Roman priests would use, which not a very smart design to put on a coin circulating in Judea. And then the reverse had a wreath with the number 18 to signify the year of the reign, or how long the Emperor Tiberius had been reigning. These coins were minted in his honor, because if Pontius Pilate had put anything regarding himself on there, he would have immediately been killed for treason. So they had to be minted. In the name of whatever emperor was reigning at the time. But again, it's not something really impressive to look at, but when you know the history of it, it's really cool because it's about as close as you can get to something that Jesus might have held during his lifetime. So I don't know. At the very least, it circulated, and maybe one of the early Christians held it. And this, I will be bringing all these to Roman Army Day. So if nothing else, if you want to come hold something that has been circulating around probably Jerusalem or the surrounding regions in the time Jesus was on the earth, there you go. So moving on, this is probably a very familiar face for most of you who know anything about history. This is the infamous Emperor Nero, and he was responsible for the first major persecution of the Christians. This is one of my examples, actually. It's actually one of my personal favorites, and it's actually in an unclean state. When I got it, I bought it off of someone who didn't really understand the value of it. So I got it for probably much cheaper than I should have. To be fair, I didn't know what the value was either until later. But I'm scared to attempt restoration on it myself because if I damage it, I lose the value of it. But and these deposits, it's not like dirt, it's actually almost like stone. You'd have to chip it off, and it would probably take 20 to 30 hours of work, which I'm not sure I have the time for. I'm probably going to pay someone to restore it professionally. But the front of it shows Nero, the obverse, and it's probably a younger bust of Nero because he doesn't really have much of the double chin that he's very famous for. Later images of Nero would show him almost obese. So this is probably an early issue of him. But on the reverse, it shows the goddess Victory. And then the letters SC stand for Senatus Consulto, which meant that the Senate approved this issue of coin. But Nero is, again, he's famous for the persecution of the early Christians. He was emperor during the execution of Peter, who was crucified upside down in his garden. And he was also emperor when Paul was beheaded. And of course, he's also famous for the fire that burnt down a large majority of the city of Rome. Whether or not he sat there and played a musical instrument is up for debate. Most historians tend to agree that he was actually fairly active in the firefighting efforts, but he nonetheless took advantage of it and ended up using a large portion of that newly opened real estate to build a large palace structure for himself. So not a great guy overall, but the coin is really nice, and hopefully will be nicer when I can afford to get it restored professionally. But just a very famous or infamous person in terms of Christian history. So next we move forward in time again to about 70 or 80 AD, and we have Vespasian, who Nero was the end of what we call the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the dynasty that Julius Caesar sort of began. At the death of Nero with no successor, there was a civil war, and ultimately the Roman general Vespasian came out on top. And Vespasian just happened to be the emperor who was putting down the first Jewish revolt at this time period. So him and his son Titus were busy reconquering Jerusalem from the rebels that had sprung up and had tried to throw off Roman rule. So this bronze sestercius of Vespasian actually celebrates the reconquest of Judea. So the obverse shows Vespasian. His dynasty is very famous for these very realistic, fat-looking portraits. You can see his big double chin. He's a very almost jolly, rotund-looking fellow. And then the reverse says Judea capta, which means Jerusalem or Judea has been captured. And it shows a Roman soldier standing over a Jewish captive sitting under a palm tree. The woman actually is a personification of Judea. So it shows the Romans' triumph over these Jewish rebels. And then this one is a piece from my personal collection. Unfortunately, I don't own a Judea capta type. One actually popped up recently that I attempted to buy, but I was very much outraced in that. They tend to be very expensive amongst collectors for their historical value to Christianity. But this is a Ass of Titus. For those of you who have your cameras on or who can see the camera, it's a fairly sizable chunk of bronze. And Titus was actually left to finish the reconquest of Judea when Vespasian left to throw his hat in the ring to become emperor. So Titus was actually the one who carried out the siege of Jerusalem. And during that siege, the rebels were using the temple as a place to hide. And one of the Roman soldiers threw a burning brand into the temple to try and smoke the rebels out, and eventually actually burnt the temple down. And on the Arch of Titus in Rome, you can see images of the Roman soldiers carrying the menorah out of the burning temple. But this particular image of Titus, very much like his father, shows a very fat, rotund figure on the obverse. And then it shows the goddess Equitas on the reverse, sort of showing the prosperity that existed during this time. These were also the emperors who, during the reign of Vespasian. He was the one who began work on what we would call the Colosseum in Rome. And actually, a lot of the funding for that came from the destruction of the temple. There's a very famous issue under Titus of the completion of the Colosseum. Another very expensive type that I have no chance of owning anytime soon, but something really interesting. And Titus also reigned during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So that's another interesting tidbit. So moving on to a little bit later, about 130 AD, there was, historians argue over whether it was the second or third Judean revolt, because there was a Jewish revolt that didn't take place primarily in Judea. I call it the second revolt because it was the second one that happened in Judea. I tend to lean in that direction, but there was a second revolt under a man named Bar Kokhba, who they named him Messiah, and rebelled against the Romans. And Hadrian led a very large army there and basically laid waste to Judea and instituted the diaspora, sending the Jews all over the empire and renaming the city of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, and the province of Judea was renamed Palestina. So that's where we get the name Palestine today. But Hadrian is a very famous emperor for his shoring up of the empire's defenses in his travel series. This coin in particular celebrates his travel to what the Romans called Asia, which would be anywhere east of Europe proper. So like Turkey, the Middle East, that was what they would call Asia. So this coin I chose because it celebrates his visit to the Middle East near where Judea is. But you have he was one of the first emperors to actually show a bust with a beard. Having a beard was seen as Greek and kind of taboo prior to this, but afterwards you'll see more and more emperors start showing their portrait with a beard, and it eventually became a symbol of sort of wisdom to have a beard. But Hadrian was the first one to have that image prominently on his coinage. And then this right here is a coin from my personal collection. It's a Depontius of Marcus Aurelius. And you can see that because it's worth double of the odds, that he actually has that radiate crown, the spikes, the spiky crown. I don't know how well this one's going to show up on camera because it's a very dark coin. Actually, in the pictures, it looks really green, but when you hold it in hand, it almost looks black. It's only in like certain lighting conditions that it actually shows green. But Marcus Aurelius is very famous for his book, The Meditations, which was basically just a private journal he kept. He was a Stoic philosopher, and his writings, he was convinced by his friends to publish his writings, and they actually survive. And it's very it's basically a kind of a self-help book, but it's very interesting. It's very I would say it's still very helpful even to the modern day. So he's very famous, and he's also famous because he was featured in the movie Gladiator, although that portrayal of him is very much not historically accurate. But here you have, again, he has the bearded bust because he was a philosopher. His beard's a little bit more wild than Hadrian's. And this was minted early on during his co-rule. He actually ruled jointly with a man named Lucius Verus, who died of the plague a few years into his reign. But this issue was actually made to show their good relationship. So the reverse actually says Concordia Augusti, or the sort of the goodwill or the concord of the emperors, and it shows the two emperors shaking hands or like holding hands together, showing that they're unified in their rule. So it's just something really cool and a little bit unique. You don't see too often these things. There was a later issue under a series of emperors that just showed their arms clasped together, but this is one of the rare instances where you see the two emperors together like that in full image like that. So 3rd century, at the end of the reign of the 5 good emperors, which were capped off by Marcus Aurelius, there was another series of civil wars after the death of his son Commodus, and the 3rd century crisis sort of began to coalesce. There were a lot of outside pressures on the empire. There were a lot more incursions by barbarian tribes. The Persians in the east, first the Parthians, the Parthian-Persian dynasty, and then later the Sasanian dynasty became very aggressive towards the Romans during this period. And then there were a lot of internal issues as well, which sort of spiraled out of control and led to what was called the crisis of the 3rd century. But here we have the last of what we call the Severan dynasty that was begun by Septimius Severus, in the beginning of the 3rd century, the end of the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 3rd century. And a lot of the emperors during his dynasty were very weak. And Severus Alexander, the denarius we have here, was no exception. His reign was very unstable. He was very young and very impressionable, and was more or less controlled by his mother. But in this bust, you actually see. Oh, I did pull his out. So here you have your denarius of Severus Alexander, and you see on the portrait there's a little bit of deposits on his face, but you see the bust of a young man, very much still a teenager. He has a wispy sort of neck beard, but it hasn't really fully grown in yet. And it's interesting to see the more realistic style that they portray these even the children emperors. They're portrayed very much realistically in this period. So you have your denarius of Severus Alexander. And during this time period, they begun what was called debasement, which I'll go into a little bit more later. But the size of the army greatly increased, and in order to continue to pay them, they started cutting copper into the silver. So this silver coin, which looks to be real, mostly silver, is only about 70 to 75% silver, and you'll see a trend of the silver content rapidly decreasing as we move on, which only led to further problems during this time. So here's another example that I own, and this is one of my personal favorite coins. This is Maximinus Thrax, who was the beginning of what we call the Barrack Emperors. He actually overthrew Severus Alexander after he paid off an army of German tribes that were threatening the frontier. The soldiers became fed up with his lack of decision and being willing to pay off enemies instead of fight. And so they actually overthrew and murdered him and took over. So Maximinus Thrax was the person who succeeded him. And it's a very large chunk. This is a sestertius. So this is worth 1/4 of the silver denarius I just showed, which in terms of weight, you would think that this would be, worth a lot more, but because it's bronze and not silver, it's actually worth far less. But the obverse portrait is Maximinus. He's very famous for his very large pointed chin. And the histories actually record that he was 8 feet tall. They think he may have suffered from gigantism, and which caused him to be far larger than most people of that day or even today. And one of the genetic signs is actually that pointed chin. So the portraits of him actually sort of confirm what the histories write, that he was probably a very large man. And then the reverse says Victoria Augusti, and it shows victory with a laurel crown to crown the emperor. And it celebrates his victory over those German tribes that Severus Alexander paid off. When they left, he actually pursued them with the Roman army and crushed them in battle in their own territory. And so this issue celebrates his victory. So next, I'm going to mention just a few emperors that have Christian significance during this time period, or significance to the rise of Christianity. So the first issue that I have here, I showed it very briefly when I was talking about tetradrachma, or the shekel of Tyre. But for those of you who have your cameras on, this is a tetradrachm of Philip the Arab. So in the East, the Romans actually continued to use the Greek terms for money, although they minted them in Roman denominations, rather than like Roman weights. But this coin is actually interesting because the legends are written in Greek and not Latin, which is fairly common in the East for these kind of issues. But Philip is particularly noteworthy because some historians believe he may have actually been a Christian, although he was very much not public about it. I personally am skeptical of that idea, but there is a good chance that he may have actually been a Christian based on some historical evidence. And again, here on this coin, we see the eagle, which was, again, just a very sort of ubiquitous symbol in the East of authority. And it's actually from this series of coins that we get the the idea for the eagle of the quarters that were minted over the last few decades of the 20th century here in America. And this was also a provincial issue from Antioch. And Antioch is very famous for being a hub of Christianity. And it's where, according to the Bible, that the Christians were first called Christians. First is actually a slur, and then later it was actually adopted by the Christians as sort of a title of honor, servants of Christ. And then here we have a very sort of different story, whereas Philip was at least amenable to Christianity and seemed fairly curious about Christianity. Trajan Decius, who actually overthrew Philip, you have a lot of overthrow during this period. There was a lot of civil wars. It's part of the crisis, part of the 3rd century. Trajan Decius, he blamed Christianity for the empire's problems. He saw these people who refused to sacrifice to the gods as the reason why the empire was in rapid decline. And so he ordered that everyone in the empire had to make sacrifices to the gods. And when a large number of Christians refused, he issued a fairly serious persecution. So that a lot of Christian martyrs were killed during the reign of Trajan Decius. And he only reigned for 2 years, but a lot of people died during his reign. And he was actually the first emperor to die in battle. But on the front here, you have Trajan Decius, who actually does not have a beard. He tried to stylize himself after earlier emperors because he was hoping that his reign would be more successful than his predecessors. But as we see, it didn't really work. His reign was very short and bloody. And then on the reverse, it actually shows the goddess Pax, or the goddess of peace, with the emperor, which again, his reign was very bloody, so it was anything but peaceful. And so here, I'm going to speak very briefly about the debasement during the 3rd century, which is part of the reason for the crisis. So the first coin that I'm showing here is a coin of, it's a Antoninianus of Gordian III. So here I have one, I have it right here. He was another child emperor. He was the youngest sole ruler of the entire empire. He was raised to the throne when he was 13 years old. And he was, his reign was put through, or his mother kind of ruled until he was old enough. But the coin, which looks like it's pure silver, is actually only about 40% silver by volume. And then just 20 years later, you have this coin issued under the usurper Posthumus. And this one is only 20% silver by volume. And it's actually only silver plated. You can actually see the bronze coming through underneath on the reverse, underneath the feet of Virtus, the god on the reverse. And I always like issues of Posthumus. He looks like Roman Santa. But moving down, you have a coin issued just 5 years later under the Emperor Claudius II. And you can see that the coin is only like 2% silver by volume. It's gotten to the point where it's almost just a little piece of bronze with just a silver wash. And then only 10 years later, under the usurper Tetragus, that was how the coin came out of the mint. There's no silver left. It's just a scrap of bronze. And actually, this coin is so fragile that, and there's a lot of times where I'm scared to handle it. Here I'm showing it for those of y'all who see the camera. But it's so thin, it's almost like a sheet of paper. I'm afraid that if I hold it too tightly, that I'll actually snap it into pieces. But there's no silver left in it, and this is the point where the empire was at its lowest prior to the collapse during the 5th century. And the empire actually split into 4 pieces and was on the verge of just total collapse. But luckily for the Romans and for us, the Emperor Aurelian came to power and restored the empire in under 5 years from its broken state to completely whole. And part of that was a coinage reform where he instituted that the coins had to all weigh a certain amount. and that they all had to have at least 5% silver by volume, which doesn't sound like much, but when you see the coins of Petricus, and then you see the coin of Aurelian, uh, by comparison, there's no doubt that it was definitely a success. You can actually still see the silvering on this coin. It doesn't come through very well in the pictures, but in the light, you can see the silver shine a little bit better. And he was named Restorer of the World by the Senate, Restitutor Orbis. And unfortunately, he was assassinated during a plot before he could really enjoy the fruits of his labor. But his legacy was carried on by his successors, like this coin of Probus, which I showed at the beginning. I'll just show him again very briefly. You can see how much the quality has increased. They're almost completely plated in silver. Well, it's a far cry from the silver coins of the past. It actually stabilized the economy enough to keep the empire from collapsing. And the crisis was ended largely by the reforms of Diocletian, who's another very infamous name in the Christian world. He actually completely reformed the coinage and did away with the old imperial system. So gone was the Antoninianus, gone was the denarius, the sestercius, and he instituted his own coinage reforms. So this is called an AE1 or a follis. And it's a fairly large chunk of bronze, nearly as large as the sestercius. But all of his coins in bronze were actually silver plated. And he did institute some silver coins, although they tended to be more rare. But Diocletian was famous for being the last major persecutor of Christianity. And so on the obverse here, you see a very stylized image of him. Moving forward, most of the portraits that you see were stylized rather than being lifelike or realistic. They were more interested in you knowing that there was an emperor and that he was powerful rather than knowing what he looked like. And his reforms were so important that they actually consider him to have started a new period of the empire. The period between Augustus and the beginning of Diocletian's reign is called the Principate. At the beginning of Diocletian's reign, they call it the Dominate, which they threw off all pretenses of being just the first citizen, the princeps, and they established themselves as emperors, as imperial figures, as rulers and monarchs. And by this point, the Romans had kind of lost their fear of monarchy, so they kind of just went along with it because they had no choice. And the reverse shows the incarnation of the spirit of the people of Rome, the Genio. But I really like this particular coin, especially because you can see so much detail. Down at the bottom under the feet, it actually has the TR that stands for the Trier mint. This is actually minted in Trier, Germany. So it's one of those coins that you can actually tell even where it was minted, which is really exciting. And then here is Constantine, who was the first publicly Christian emperor, if you consider Philip to have possibly have been a Christian. Constantine succeeded Diocletian and his immediate successors in the Tetrarchy, and reunited the empire under his own personal rule. So this is Diocletian. It's actually a fairly rare helmeted type, and you can actually see the traces of the silver around some of the portions of the coin, like around his helmet, and on the back around the victories. But he was famous for his Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity, and then being the calling member of the Council of Nicaea, which sort of established Christian doctrine. And then the reverse has the winged victories, showing his sort of accomplishments. So moving on from Constantine, Christianity was legal, but it wasn't the state religion, and that would continue for some time. But here we have a very small bronze issue of Helena, who was the mother of Constantine. And I've included her because she actually was a Christian before her son. And she led an expedition to Jerusalem and excavated the site of Golgotha. And as legend says, she actually discovered the true cross that was buried there. And so she was the one who built the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre on this site of Christ's death. So she's beloved, especially in Catholic and Orthodox circles, as a saint, Saint Helena of the Cross. But her inclusion is mainly because she just is a very important figure in the rise of Christianity. Um, uh, and it's also kind of interesting to see the way that women are portrayed in the Roman period. And then next we have this bronze Maiorina of Magnentius, who was a Western usurper. Really, I included it mainly for the fact that he put very obvious Christian imagery on his coins. The Christogram representing the name Jesus Christ in Greek, and then the Alpha and the Omega. He was hoping that his appeal to Christianity would save him from the Eastern Emperor Theodosius, and it really did not. He was defeated in battle and killed. But Theodosius was the one who issued the edict that made Christianity the official religion of the empire and shut down all the pagan temples and began persecuting paganism. But this continued on until the end of the empire in the West. And then I just have a couple of cool examples of coins in the Eastern Empire, which survived after the fall of the West. And you can see a lot of Christian imagery continue on. There's the first coin is Emperor Justinian. Then you have Maurice Tiberius with the archangel holding the scepter and the globe, which show his right to rule. Then you have the down at the bottom left, you have the anonymous phallus, which was minted around the year 1000 when they thought Christ would return. And so they minted coins showing Christ and saying his name, Jesus Christ, King of Kings, in order to show how pious they were. Although this type was started by a guy called Basil the Bulgar Slayer. So how pious they actually were, that's up for debate. And then the final one that I had pictured here is it's called a Byzantine cup coin. It was minted around the time of the Fourth Crusade. It was actually issued by Latin crusaders who had conquered Constantinople, and they melted down a lot of the ancient statues and stuff in the city and turned them into coins. So this is a coin that is entirely possibly made from an ancient Greek or Roman statue that was melted down and turned into this little scrap. It's technically bill in silver, but there's negligible silver content in it. But just showing that this sort of Christianization of imagery progressed on into the Roman Empire of the East long after the Western Empire had fallen. And that coin was minted in the 13th century. So the 1200s, it's 700-800 years after the fall of the West. So that kind of concludes a sort of a very brief dig through coinage history in the ancient world. Kind of went over time. I like this topic too much, but I'll pass it back to Christy, and then she can decide if we have any time for Q&A or if she wants to cut this out.
I mean, absolutely. There's time for Q&A. So thank you so much for that lecture. I learned so much. I thought I knew a lot about coins just because I had to take care of a few coin hoards at an old museum where I used to work, but this was incredible. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions for Caleb?
I have one here in the chat from Mike Connell, or he messaged me. He asked, was Hadrian's Wall in Scotland named after him? And yes, the answer is yes. Hadrian did shore up the defenses of a lot of different parts of the empire. And one of the things that he did was build that wall to prevent the Pictish tribes that inhabited the northern part of the British Isles from attacking south and raiding into Roman-controlled territory. They didn't think that the area north of the wall was worth conquering. It just didn't have enough resources. It was just a burden on the economy. So rather than try to conquer it and pacify it, they just built a wall. And it actually facilitated trade between the sides. So it actually ended up being very lucrative.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I love how Hadrian goes for because I heard that Romans, they see the beard as very Greek, but when you're out on campaign, you grow out a beard usually. And so Hadrian's trying to be like a total bro, for lack of a better word, growing out the beard.
He is. He's very much, he's sort of showing solidarity. And he actually spent a lot of his reign, he spent very little time stationary. He was moving around a lot, traveling around to the different provinces, visiting and shoring up defenses and traveling with the army. So he probably did just not have a lot of time to shave on campaign. So that's
Yeah.
probably a large reason for his beard.
Yeah.
Mike asked me, where do I obtain my coins? So the guy I mentioned at the beginning, Brian Cohn, was for a long time sort of a middleman in terms of he would buy them from reputable dealers or auction houses, and he would help people who didn't necessarily have time find what they were looking for. And I was actually working with him as sort of an apprentice, as you will. Unfortunately, fortunately for him, and I'm really happy for him, he actually was hired by the auction house C&G to work in their ancient coins department. So he's actually in the process of moving to Pennsylvania to join their team, which is amazing. But it also means that I'm kind of out of my plug for coins. So now I actually have to do the hard work myself. But that's the simple answer. But there's a lot of different places to look. Just make sure that when you're buying, you go to reputable sources. I don't recommend eBay. I don't recommend unverified sites, but there are a lot of good auction houses. Vcoins.com is really excellent, although you will be paying a premium there compared to auction houses. But auction houses, it's a bidding process. So if you want to just get something and not worry about the bidding or having to fight over it, then vcoins.com. Everything there is verified. You won't be buying anything. You won't be buying anything. You won't be buying anything.
Caleb?
Yeah.
Caleb,
Yes.
this is Bob Fletcher.
Hi, Bob.
Oh, hi. I've been collecting for over 35 years. So
Oh, excellent.
I have a fairly exhaustive collection of biblical coins. And 2 points. One I want to make with addressing the question of where do you buy them.
Mhm.
It has been my experience that there is a large percentage of fakes that are on the internet.
Very true.
So you have got to be very, very careful. I personally have a dealer in Chicago, and I do heritage auctions a lot. I do Vcoins, but there's also been a law passed now from both Italy and Greece, and there's talk that Israel is also going to pass the same law that if you can't do provenance before 1968 on your coins, they're going to want them back. So you've got to buy these from people who can give you provenance of where they got them from, and how long they've had them, and what collection, and all that kind of stuff. So you have to have paperwork, or you're going to get into trouble.
Very true.
Second thing is, I also have countermarks of Roman legion on some of these coins that are pretty cool. When the Roman legions would countermark coins that have been used a lot, but they want to use them for pay, they would countermark them. Like, for example, the 10th Roman legion that was stationed in Jerusalem, they would countermark their coins with an X or with in this case, a boar. That was one of their marks. And so countermarked coins are pretty cool too.
They absolutely.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of cool countermarks. I've never seen the one specifically associated to the 10th Legion, but I've seen Roman countermarks, and they're actually really common amongst the successor kingdoms of Alexander. A lot of the coins, like the Seleucid coins or the Ptolemaic coins, would actually be countermarked with their rivals' mark for circulation in their country. So like you'll find Seleucid coins with Ptolemaic countermarks that circulated in Egypt and things like that. So yeah,
absolutely.
You're right. Countermark coins are really awesome.
So you did a good job today. I want to say that you did a great job with the historical background of this stuff. And anyone who wants to get involved in this game, you need to know what the history is and what you're doing and what you're getting. So
absolutely. Thank you so much.
If you ever want to see it, we ought to get together at the Biblical Archaeologist Center, and I'll bring the stuff down and we can talk.
That'd be awesome. If you're going to come down for Roman Army Day, I would love to see what you've got. I'll be there actually next weekend, all day on Saturday. So
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
job.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think Brenda had a hand up, maybe.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. I
Hi.
joined in a little bit late. I really enjoyed what I did here. And if I'm repeating, if you had already answered these questions, forgive me. But I guess I have two. How many coins have you collected so far? And have you ever done any on-site excavation over in the Middle East for any of your coins?
So my collection is roughly about 50. I try to acquire at least a few per year. I kind of went crazy my initial year and ended up with like 30. And after that, it's been more of a slow trickle as I try to fill in holes in the collection rather than being gung ho about just buying everything that I see within my budget. Being a little more selective, trying to save a little bit more and then buy higher end things or things that have a little bit more historical value. But unfortunately, I have no experience with archaeological digs. I think actually Christy would probably be able to speak into that better than me. I don't really have any experience with the actual finding of these things. I'm more my knowledge is more theoretical and more based in the historical background of them rather than the actual the physical excavation of them.
Yeah, and were he to go on a dig and find a coin, they wouldn't let him keep it. It would belong to the nation in which he found it. That's the way the rules go now.
Very
There's
true.
no more finders, keepers, losers, weepers,
Mhm.
as we're seeing with the
Oh, okay.
return of the Benin bronzes and the
That would be hard.
Parthenon marbles.
Definitely. There's
That
still
would be
some
hard.
people that do like private stuff. There's actually a really cool YouTube channel called Metal Detective Pannonia that I do recommend for people who are interested in seeing people find ancient coins in real time. His identity is actually hidden in the channel to protect his identity because certain countries would prosecute him even just for doing his own metal detecting in his own land. But he finds a lot of really cool stuff, and a lot of it ends up for sale online. So that's really cool. And then if you're interested in more information and like the more historical background, there's a really awesome YouTube channel called Classical Numismatics. It's run by a guy named Leonardo Barros, and he does really awesome, super deep dives into like specific coins, into specific time periods, rulers. But he has stuff all the way from like beginner collecting information and stuff to very high end stuff that he has people from high end collections like lend him to do videos and stuff. So I really highly recommend his videos if you want to learn more about pretty much anything related to ancient coins. His channel is top notch.
Awesome. That's a great reference for us to check out if we want to kind of look and
Thank you.
see more.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Does anyone else
Of the
have any
coins that you have-
questions? Oh, go
what-
ahead. Sorry.
yeah. Of the coins that you have, what's your favorite and why?
Whew, I knew I was going to get this question, and I'm still not prepared for it. So,
Or a few, top 2 or 3.
so the Magnentius, the one with the Christogram, is the first one I got. So it has a special place in my heart. The Diocletian was actually the second one I got, and I got it mainly for the portrait because I thought it was really awesome. And then I'm like, oh, that's Diocletian. That's that's really cool. Favorites. That's so I think I'm gonna have to go with the Sestercius of Maximinus. It's actually one that I carry around with me pretty much everywhere I go as a pocket coin, just to show people who might be interested in the hobby and just kind of just wow people. It's not like the highest quality and it's nowhere near the most expensive, but it's from a really interesting time period that I really enjoy. There was very famously the year of the 4 emperors, very famously the year of the 5 emperors, but he actually reigned during what was called the year of the 6 emperors, which is less known but far more interesting. I really wish they'd make like a historical series about it because it'd be far more interesting than most things on TV these days.
Very nice. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. Well, does anyone else have any questions for Mr. Smith? Okay. Well, Caleb, thank you so much for speaking today. I really did enjoy that, and I really did learn a lot, and enjoyed every minute of it. And
Yes.
I'm looking forward to seeing you on Saturday. I hope to see many of you this upcoming Saturday, May 6th, for our Roman Army Day. So really, we appreciate y'all. If y'all come out to that, you get to see Caleb and his coins as well. This is actually what inspired me to bring him to do a virtual lecture, as he started telling me about his coins last year. And I was like, this is so cool. We should bring you on.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you.
Then, please feel free to join us as well for our next virtual lecture if you're interested. It's with Pastor Adam Camp, and it's a continuation of his last lecture, How the Bible Came to Us. So it's part 2. The first lecture was basically from its inspiration to the Bible being formed. And so this next lecture, I believe, is going to go through, okay, how did it get into the vernacular? So, so we're going to have to go
Nice.
through some Reformation stuff probably at that time. So join us for that one. It's going to be in early August. Specifically put early August because I'm due in like late August, early September. So I don't want to miss it for going into labor. So so please join us for that. Keep an eye out on our social media page. Caleb, thank you again. I'll send you a follow-up email tomorrow just regarding your honorarium and everything. But thank you guys so much. And we'll hopefully see you next time.
Take
Yes,
care, guys.
thank you. Caleb. Thank you.
Thank you,
Enjoy
Christy.
Roman Army.
Caleb.
Enjoy.
Bye.